some of these items I will pre-bake and then freeze, and other items I will actually freeze unbaked and then bake them from the freezer. I am really excited to share this with you. You might not notice in this video, but I'm actually 36 weeks pregnant and I am getting ready to have a baby in a few weeks. So in order to plan for that and to help myself, but also my family have some food that we are used to having on hand, I'm going to be doing a big bake this week. So I'm excited to share that with you. All the things I'm making, how I'm making it, and you can kind of see a peek into a heavy baking week, which isn't typical for me, and how I fit it all into the week. My first step is I have a meal plan that I create for my family, and I usually update it seasonally based on what we're eating. And so on my meal plan, I usually circle like the meals that we're having. But then really important down here, especially for sourdough baking, is I have a prep section. And so what I did for this week is I kind of thought about what are some health things that we'd like to have on hand, or that I especially would like to have on hand after the baby arrives. And I planned an entire week based on like what's happening that day. And it was also really important for me to plan for when I would be refreshing my starter, because that's a really key part of sourdough baking. On the night before our Sunday night, I refreshed my starter and made a really big batch, as you can see. On Monday, that was the day I knew I'd be home with the kids, and so I planned for a lot of baking and prep on that day. I put some of the active starter to use right away, making a double batch of sourdough tortillas. So I made the dough and let that ferment, and while that was fermenting, I made my double batch of honey oat sourdough sandwich bread. And this one's so delicious. After that dough was made, this one again went into my bin and fermented at room temperature. Later in the afternoon, it was time to shape the balls of my tortilla dough. So I got it out of the bin and I shaped it into 32 small individual balls and let these rest so they would roll out easier and bake up into just gorgeous tortillas. Roll all these out, put them on a plate, and made some for dinner. And then the rest I let cool completely before I stored them. After dinner, while the rest of the tortillas were cooling, I shaped my 2 loaves of honey oat sandwich bread. So pre-shape them first, prepare my liners in the sandwich pans. While my 2 loaves of sandwich bread were resting, I actually whipped up this really quick batch of sourdough discard oatmeal raisin cookies. That recipe was so easy to put together. It really only took a few minutes to put the dough together. And did the final shaping for each loaf. Once my loaves of sandwich bread were shaped, I covered them with plastic wrap and these went into the fridge to continue proofing overnight. After my cookies were made and the dough was resting in the fridge to continue doing some more fermentation, and my sandwich loaves were in the fridge proofing, I made my big batch of Knead sourdough. While that was mixing up, I refreshed my starter. I looked at my schedule to see what I was baking the next day to make sure that I was making enough starter for all my recipes for day 2. So I mixed that together. And then I covered that to let it rest overnight at room temperature. Knead sourdough went in the bin, and that as well was sitting overnight at room temperature to use in the morning. All my cool tortillas got stored in a Ziploc bag in the fridge to use later in the week. On day 2, the first thing I did was I preheated my oven for my sourdough English muffins I was making with the no-knead dough. I took most of the no-knead sourdough out of the container and put it on the counter, and then shaped it into small balls about the size of a lemon and made them nice and tight, and so they were resting while my pan was getting preheated. Then all my English muffins, I pre-bake on the outside, just kind of fry them up on both sides so they have the right texture and right shape when they're baking. Once they've all been through that pre-bake step, then they all went to the oven to finish baking. And then cooled on the rack for me to process later. Then I baked my 2 loaves of sandwich bread that had been proofing in the fridge overnight. While those loaves were baking in my steamy oven, I took all my cookie that had been resting in the fridge overnight and I shaped those into individual cookie dough balls and put those into the freezer on a baking pan to par freeze. Now that all my English muffins are cooled down, I'm cutting them all in half for easier storage. And of course, having some for breakfast. So now my sandwich loaves are out. They're going to cool. One is going to be for our family. One's going to be for storing for once it's completely cooled down. To store the English muffins, I try to keep them cut in half but intact so they would store easily as a match. They'll be much easier to toast in the toaster because they're cut in half. They're not as thick and bulky, and they'll toast more evenly this way. Once those are all in my bag, those go to the freezer. And now my balls of par frozen cookie dough go in a Ziploc bag as well. Now I'm taking some time to clean up, of course. An important part of a big bulk bake is making sure you're cleaning up behind yourself. So took some time in this morning to clean up. In the afternoon, I made a batch of my sourdough discard pumpkin spice scones. This is a big double batch. I covered it with plastic wrap and let it sit in the fridge until day 3. On day 3, I took the pumpkin spice scone dough out, divided it in half, and shaped it into 16 scones. And so there'll be 32 scones all together. So these 32 scones are going to go in my fridge in this shaped form to sit and continue fermenting in the cold fridge for a few more hours. And then after they're chilled again, I'm going to transfer them to the freezer to par freeze so they're set before I store them. Now that my sandwich loaf has sat overnight, it is perfect for cutting into thin, even slices. So I'm slicing up my whole second loaf of sandwich bread so I can store all the slices in some freezer bags so they can be easily pulled out and then toasted in the toaster and come back just like fresh baked. On my bags, I like to also write the instructions so whoever's getting something out of the freezer, whether it's me or my kids, that the instructions are right there, especially if it's baking, the temperature, the timing, so no one has to look it up and it's easy to see right there. So now that my scones are par frozen, they're gonna go in the freezer bag. Here's the first half of the batch, and then later I did the second half of the batch into my freezer bag. You wanna press out as much air as possible before you store these. Now that my starter from that day is all turned to discard, it's time for me to make my discard sponge for my big batch of waffles for day 4. On day 4, my sponge was nice and bubbly and active, and so it was time to add the other ingredients to make the batter. And I baked all the waffles, some small ones and then some large Belgian ones. Some, of course, were for our family for breakfast. That's always an important part of bulk baking, is making sure that you're incorporating your meal plan with your bulk bake. And then all the rest of the waffles cooled at room temperature until they're completely cooled down. Once they were completely cooled down, I store them in large freezer bags. The little piece of parchment keep the waffles from sticking to one another so they can be pulled out easily to toast in the toaster. So now my freezer is stocked with about 20 balls of cookie dough, 21 English muffins, a whole loaf of pre-sliced sandwich bread, 32 pumpkin spice scones, and about 30 waffles. And the sourdough tortillas got used later that week for leftover lunches and for dinner. So I hope you enjoyed going through this big bake week for me. This is definitely not my typical baking routine. I usually do about 2 or 3 sourdough recipes in a week, sometimes 4 if it's a special occasion. But this was really fun to do since I didn't have my big kids and I had a little more time in the evening. So I hope that it gives you something that excites you for planning ahead in your week or for doing some big baking around your house, because I know that this is going to be really helpful later. So I hope that you enjoyed it, and I would love it if you would share this with a friend, whether they're a busy mom, whether they're pregnant or have a baby, whoever they are. I hope that they can enjoy this just as much as you did. Please give this video a like, and for more sourdough content, please follow my channel, subscribe, and I can't wait to see you next time.